Millionaire CEO gets into the car and hears a black little girl tell him to shut up. The reason was he was used to people lowering their heads when he walked into a room. But the moment he opened the car door, a tiny black girl stared him down and ordered him to shut up. It wasn't rudeness. It wasn't attitude. It was something darker. Something carved by years of pain. Why would a child dare speak to a man like him with such fire? And what was she about to reveal that could destroy everything he thought he knew? The city always bowed to him, though he never noticed how heavy that crown of silent admiration really was. To most, he was the picture of power, a millionaire. CEO with the kind of presence that made boardrooms tremble and entire companies reshape their futures. Money, prestige, influence. These things followed him like shadows, never questioned, never denied. But in his polished world of glass towers and chauffeured cars, there was a silence no wealth could break. A silence born of distance from the lives of ordinary people, especially those who carried burdens invisible to men like him. His mornings were choreographed perfection. Coffee brewed by unseen staff, crisp suits pressed without a wrinkle, headlines flashing his face in financial, journals as a symbol of triumph. Yet beneath the surface of his empire, there was an emptiness he never named. Success had stripped away the raw edges of humanity, leaving him insulated in comfort, but starving for something he didn't understand. The little girl entered his life not with ceremony, but with disruption. She was everything his world avoided, poor, vulnerable, and marked by the harshest kind of prejudice. The kind that followed her not because of mistakes or choices, but because of the color of her skin. Her life unfolded in the shadows of cracked sidewalks, where children's laughter was often replaced by sirens and whispered warnings. Each day she learned that the world did not welcome her innocence. It judged her before she could even find her voice. She was small, with eyes that carried storms too old for her years. Her clothes told the story of struggle, threadbare hand-me-downs barely stitched together, but her spirit clung to resilience like a flame refusing to die out. She had been forced to understand cruelty too early, and though she rarely spoke, her silence held a weight that silenced others in turn. Their meeting was accidental, at least in the way chance disguises itself as fate. He didn't see her first. He felt her presence, like a disturbance in the air of his perfectly ordered world. The car door closed, the city noise muffled, and there she was, sitting across from him, small, defiant, out of place in every possible way. For him, the car was a sanctuary of control, a capsule separating him from chaos. For her, it was a cage. Another space she hadn't chosen, another reminder of how powerless she was. She did not lower her eyes. She did not fold into silence. Instead, her voice cut through the leather and glass, trembling yet unyielding. Shut up. It wasn't a child's tantrum. It wasn't disrespect. It was the sound of a wound speaking, of years of bruised dignity finding one raw moment of courage. He didn't know why those words stung so sharply, but something in them cracked. The armor he had built around his life, and though he had the power to silence her, to dismiss her existence with a single gesture, he didn't. He couldn't. Because in that instant, for the first time, he realized that her pain was something his money couldn't erase. And the question lingered like a whisper he couldn't escape. What had the world done to this child to make her voice tremble with so much fury? The world outside his tinted window raced past in a blur of noise and light, but inside the car, time slowed. He sat back, every instinct telling him to reclaim control, to reassert the authority he wore like a second skin. But her presence unsettled him, not because she challenged him, but because she forced him to see something he had spent his entire life avoiding, the raw face of suffering, too close to ignore. He studied her quietly, not as an executive calculating profit, but as a man, suddenly stripped of certainty. Her small fists rested tensely on her lap, knuckles white with pressure, as though she carried battles invisible to anyone else. She looked at him not with the awe he was accustomed to, but with eyes that burned with a silent accusation. He had been measured and found guilty in a trial he didn't even know he was part of. His mind drifted to the polished skyscrapers that bore his name, the empire he had built from ambition and relentless drive. There, he was untouchable. In those rooms, his voice was law. But here, in this confined space with a child half hidden behind trauma, he was powerless. No title, no wealth, no strategy could undo the quiet, broken courage it took for her to defy him. She came from streets he had only ever glimpsed from afar, the kind his luxury car glided past without a second thought. Neighborhoods branded by poverty, where prejudice was stitched into the fabric of everyday life, where children like her learned not only the alphabet but also the art of survival, how to move quickly, how to avoid stares, how to swallow insults that cut deeper than fists. The scars of her world were invisible, but they lived in her every gesture. He wondered how many times she had been told to be quiet. How often adults, teachers, strangers, even neighbors had silenced her voice before it could bloom. And yet here she was, daring to speak, daring to command silence from a man who had built his life on silencing others. It was a paradox that gnawed at him. Her weakness was her strength, her fragility a shield sharper than anything he owned. As the car rolled through the city, he thought of the walls between their lives. His penthouse with glass walls overlooking. The skyline, her cramped apartment with peeling paint and floors that creaked under the weight of too many secrets. His future paved with certainty, hers tangled in obstacles she didn't deserve. Yet fate, in its cruel irony, had drawn their paths together in this fleeting collision. There was something unspoken about her presence, as though she carried not just her own story, but the weight of many before her, generations who had fought to be seen, to be heard, to exist without fear. He saw it in the defiance of her posture, in the way her gaze never wavered even as her small body trembled. She was more than a child. She was the echo of battles fought in silence, the living proof of wounds society tried to bury. And for the first time in years he felt shame. Shame not for what he had done, but for what he had ignored. His wealth had insulated him from pain like hers, and in doing so it had made him blind. But now that blindness was unraveling, thread by thread, and he knew he could not look away. The car slowed at a traffic light, and for a fleeting moment their reflections merged in the glass. His sharply cut suit, her faded clothes, his expensive watch glinting in the dim light, her small hands scarred by neglect. Two worlds staring back at each other, impossibly different, yet bound together in the silence of that moment. It wasn't pity that stirred in him. It was something deeper, something unsettling, a recognition that her pain held more truth than his victories ever could. He realized then that life had placed her in his path for a reason, though he didn't yet know what it was. And as the light turned green and the car moved forward, a single thought lingered like a warning in his chest. This was only the beginning. The city stretched endlessly outside, unaware of the silent storm brewing in the back seat of a black luxury car. He shifted uneasily, the polished leather beneath him suddenly feeling less like comfort and more like a barrier, one that kept him apart from a world he had never bothered to understand. The child's defiance still echoed in his mind. "Shut up." The command replayed like a bell tolling, shaking something loose in the chambers of his conscience. His wealth had made him immune to accountability. In boardrooms, every word he spoke was met with nods, his presence alone bending outcomes in his favor. But this child, she had not bowed. She had not hesitated. She had taken the one thing nobody had ever dared to take from him: authority. The more he studied her, the more questions unraveled. Where were her parents? What forces had molded such resilience in someone so young? Children were supposed to carry laughter, wonder, and innocence. But she seemed carved from pain, each glance of hers weighted with unshed tears. It was as if life had demanded she grow up before she even had the chance to be a child. He thought about his own childhood, wrapped in privilege, a father who built him stairways to success, a mother who shielded him from discomfort. He had been handed opportunities others spent their lives chasing. His story was paved in gold. Hers seemed written in blood and stone. And still, she had looked him in the eye and silenced him. That defiance was a strength he had never possessed. The car rolled past neighborhoods his money rarely touched. Cracked pavements, shuttered shops, walls marked with graffiti that told stories no glossy magazine would ever print. He realized uncomfortably that this was her world. While he sat at gala dinners raising money for causes he barely understood, children like her lived the reality those causes pretended to solve. And here she was, living evidence of his blindness, a fragile mirror reflecting the truth of inequality. He wondered, almost with dread, what she might reveal if he listened. As minutes stretched into silence, the air inside the car grew heavier. He realized that this wasn't about a child telling him to be quiet. This was about a child daring to claim space in a world determined to erase her voice. That act alone was revolutionary. She shifted slightly, her shoulders tightening as if bracing against a blow. It struck him then how instinctive her defense seemed. Children weren't supposed to live on guard, yet she sat there back straight, eyes sharp, as though waiting for the world to attack. He wondered how many times it already had. He thought about the subtle ways society destroyed children like her, not always with fists, but with words, looks, and silence. Teachers with lowered expectations, strangers who crossed streets, stores that followed her every move, neighbors who muttered, warnings behind closed doors. Each small act of dismissal piled up until innocence cracked under the weight. And now he was staring at the result. A girl who had learned to raise her voice before anyone else could take it away, and he, for all his influence, had never once considered how many children walked into each day, knowing the world was against them. Until now. The driver announced something faintly, but the words dissolved into the background. All he could focus on was her presence. It unnerved him that she had so much power without even knowing it. Power to make him question. Power to make him see. His chest tightened with something he rarely allowed himself to feel: helplessness. He was a man who had built solutions, engineered triumphs, conquered challenges. But this wasn't a problem to solve with contracts or money. This was human pain, carved into the soul of a child. And for the first time in his life, He had no idea what to do. By the time the car slowed again, night had begun to press against the city skyline. The shadows deepened, and with them, his thoughts. He realized their meeting was no accident. Life had a way of tearing down walls when they grew too high. Perhaps this was his reckoning, his reminder that wealth did not absolve him from humanity. She turned her head then, and for a flicker of a moment, he caught the depth of her eyes. They weren't simply angry. They weren't merely defiant. They were pleading, not for him to leave her alone, but for someone, anyone, to finally listen. That look lodged in his chest like a blade. It stripped him of pride, of titles, of money. In her gaze, he was not a millionaire CEO. He was simply a man being asked, silently but desperately, "Will you keep ignoring what the world does to us, or will you finally see?" And he knew then that his life had just been divided into two parts: before her and after her. Whatever story was about to unfold, it would not leave him unchanged. The city's lights glimmered outside like distant stars, but inside that car, one truth shone brighter than all the rest. His world was no longer his own. This was the beginning of something far greater, far heavier than he had ever carried before. The city was different when he looked at it through her eyes. What once felt like a kingdom under his control now looked like a battlefield she was forced to cross every day. The next morning, when circumstances drew them together again, he found himself noticing things he had never seen before. The way shopkeepers stiffened when she walked by, the way strangers whispered with suspicion, the way space seemed to close around her as if the world had silently decided she was unwelcome. It was subtle, so subtle he realized why he had missed it all these years. Prejudice didn't always roar. It whispered, smirked, nudged, and it scarred just as deeply. He watched her shrink slightly under the weight of those stares, her chin tightening though her eyes stayed forward. She had learned, far too young, how to carry humiliation like armor. Yet the sight stirred something in him that contracts and business rivalries never had: outrage. Not the kind he used in boardrooms, but the helpless kind that ate at the heart because it couldn't be solved with money. When they stopped at a cafe, the reaction was immediate. The server's smile faltered, eyes flicking from his tailored suit to her worn dress. There was hesitation, the kind that pretended to be politeness but stank of judgment. He noticed it all now: the lowered voice, the forced tone, the subtle shift of plates, as if the girl's presence might stain them. He had power enough to demand respect, but she didn't. And when she stood there, small and silent, he felt the cruel imbalance of it all. For the first time, his wealth embarrassed him. He could shield himself from shame, but she could not. Later, on the street, two boys their age leaned from bicycles and shouted words he wished he had never heard, words that reduced her humanity to the color of her skin. The cruelty was casual, tossed like trash in the air, but he saw how it struck her. She didn't flinch. She didn't respond. She had been taught that silence was survival. But he felt the words like daggers. He wanted to shout back, to use his power, his reputation, his influence to crush them into silence. But she touched her small hand against the seat beside her, steadying herself, and he realized this was her every day. This was normal. And that truth broke something inside him. The more he saw, the more unbearable it became. Every look, every whisper, every slight. He wondered how many times she had endured this before he ever noticed. How many children carried. These wounds quietly while men like him turned away, and in those silent moments he began to realize her shut up had never been about him personally. It had been about the world that had taught her that silence was survival, that even as a child she had to command the noise around her to stop before it swallowed her whole. Now he couldn't stop asking himself the question that burned like fire. What would happen to her if nobody ever listened? The days that followed blurred into a painful education for him. The child's presence drew back the curtain on a world he had always chosen to ignore, and once revealed, he could no longer look away. At his office, the girl's existence caused whispers. Colleagues eyed her with suspicion, their smiles tight, questions buried behind forced politeness. The very walls of his empire, built to celebrate power and wealth, now echoed with quiet prejudice. They asked, without asking, what business a child like her had in such a place. He saw it in their eyes. She didn't belong. But the truth was undeniable. It wasn't she who was out of place. It was them. Their carefully polished judgments looked ugly beside her raw honesty. The silence she carried exposed how shallow their world had become. One evening, he took her to a charity gala, an event where he was expected to parade generosity. He imagined it would open doors for her, show her beauty and refinement beyond her daily struggles. But the opposite happened. Beneath the chandeliers and silk gowns, she became a spectacle. Guests watched her not with admiration, but with thinly veiled discomfort. She wasn't a child in their eyes. She was a reminder of the divisions they pretended didn't exist. A woman leaned close to him and whispered that his choice of company might ruin his reputation. He clenched his jaw, the words searing into him. His wealth, his influence, his image. Suddenly it all felt so fragile compared to the resilience in the child standing beside him. The girl stayed quiet, but her silence wasn't ignorance. It was knowing. She had seen these looks before. She had lived them all her life. But for him, this was new and unbearable. He began noticing how prejudice crept into every corner. A shopkeeper double-counting her change. Security guards watching her every move while pretending to look away. Teachers speaking to her as though she couldn't understand. Even children her own age kept their distance, mimicking the distrust they had absorbed from their parents, each moment pressed on him like a stone. His wealth had always shielded him from rejection, but now he felt its sting second-hand through her. And though he wasn't the one being judged, he found the shame clinging to him all the same. One afternoon they walked through a park. Laughter floated from groups of children playing freely, but when she stepped closer, the play stopped. Parents gathered their children, subtle but sharp, as if her presence alone carried danger. He watched her freeze, her small hands twisting at her sides, her gaze dropping to the ground. Something inside him snapped. For the first time in years, his voice thundered, not at board members or competitors, but at strangers who saw danger in a child's skin. He demanded answers, but none came. They only looked back with blank stares, muttered excuses, and walked away. But it was too late. The damage was done. He saw the way her shoulders slumped, the way she folded into herself. Not from their rejection, but from knowing she had seen this pattern too many times to expect anything else. He realized then that his outrage wasn't enough. He could shout, protest, and fight, but she was the one forced to live inside that reality every day, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't take that weight from her. That night, Lying awake in his penthouse, he replayed the days, events. He thought of how easily his money bent the world to his will, except here. No dollar could buy her dignity back. No influence could erase those stares. For the first time, he questioned whether his power meant anything at all. As days turned to weeks, the tension escalated. His colleagues grew restless, his reputation whispered about in back rooms. "He's lost his mind," they said. "He's ruining everything." Investors doubted him. Board members distanced. Themselves and the empire he had built began to tremble under the weight of their judgment. But he no longer cared about their approval. What gnawed at him was the way the world crushed the spirit of a child before she even had the chance to grow. Still, the backlash grew louder. The media caught wind of the unusual bond. Headlines questioned his motives, painted her as a burden, hinted at scandal. The story twisted into something cruel, feeding society's hunger for gossip. And in every line, she was reduced to nothing more than her skin. She felt it too. He saw it in her eyes, the way she avoided her reflection, the way she shrank in public spaces. The world wasn't just whispering now. It was roaring, determined to drown her voice. And yet, in the midst of it, she remained steady. She still carried herself with quiet defiance, her silence heavy with truths the world refused to hear. He realized then that she wasn't weak at all. She was stronger than him, stronger than all of them, because she had endured what they could barely even look at. The rising tide of prejudice, the collapsing walls of his empire, the heavy weight of her unspoken story, they all converged toward an inevitable breaking point. He knew it was coming. A moment when silence would no longer be an option, when the world's cruelty would erupt in one raw confrontation. And when it came, it would demand everything from him. It happened on a day like any other, when the world seemed almost quiet, almost safe. He had grown used to the whispers, the sidelong glances, the sting of judgment shadowing their every step. But nothing prepared him for the storm that would finally shatter everything. They were in the heart of the city, stepping out of his car. The sun burned against mirrored windows, and the plaza buzzed with movement, suits, shoppers, voices colliding in 1,000 directions. To him, it was routine. To her, it was another battlefield. At first, it was small, a sneer from a passerby. A muttered word spat just low enough to sting without consequence. She tensed, as she always did, her silence wrapping around her like armor. But then the mutters grew louder. A group of strangers lingered, their stares unflinching, their voices sharp. Words cut through the air, ugly and raw, aimed not just at her, but at everything she represented. He froze. He had heard prejudice before, but not like this. Not so naked, not so merciless. The cruelty spilled into the open, uncaring of who was listening, uncaring of who it broke. And then, the moment that turned the air to ice, one of them stepped forward and unleashed words so vile, so heavy with hatred, that the crowd itself seemed to recoil. The girl flinched, not outwardly, not with sound, but with a flicker in her eyes that he would never forget. For the first time, her silence looked fragile, cracked. Her armor breaking under the weight of the world, something inside him erupted. This wasn't a business deal he could walk away from. This wasn't a boardroom fight he could win with strategy. This was humanity stripped raw, and if he stayed silent, he would become the very cruelty she had been fighting her whole life, and So, standing in the plaza, surrounded by strangers, investors, colleagues, and cameras that never missed a scandal, he made his choice. He would not stay silent. The plaza erupted into chaos. At first, it was only a few voices, but in seconds, the cruelty multiplied. Strangers who didn't know her felt bold enough to sneer, emboldened by the ugliness spilling into the air. A handful laughed, others whispered, some recorded with their phones, hungry for a spectacle. The cruelty wasn't just in the words. It was in the indifference, the smirks, the willingness to let a child be devoured by hate. She stood frozen, her small hands balled into fists, her shoulders trembling. For years, she had carried silence, like a weapon, believing that if she stayed quiet, she might survive. But here, in front of hundreds of eyes, silence wasn't enough. Silence wasn't safety. Silence was surrender. He saw it. He saw the way her chest rose and fell too quickly, the way her chin quivered, though she fought to hold it still. She was breaking, and no child should ever have to learn how to break in front of an audience. His instincts screamed at him to protect her, but another voice inside whispered of consequences. Investors were watching. Reporters had their cameras trained on him. One wrong move, and the empire he had spent his life building would come crashing down. If he defended her now, he would not only lose respect in the eyes of the powerful, he would become a target himself. For a moment he wavered. All his years of conditioning pulled him toward silence, toward calculation. But then, she looked up at him, just once. Her eyes, dark and fragile, asked him a single, silent question. Will you stand with me? And in that gaze, he found his answer. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and the crowd. The murmurs rippled instantly. Some scoffed, others sneered, and the air tightened with hostility. But he didn't falter. For once, he wasn't a CEO, wasn't a man of power. He was simply human. He spoke, and his voice carried more weight than it ever had in any boardroom. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make speeches. He didn't soften the truth. He told them what they didn't want to hear, that their hatred was cowardice, that their cruelty toward a child was proof of everything broken in the world. The backlash was immediate. Cameras clicked furiously, voices rose in anger, accusations flew. Some called him reckless, others mocked his compassion as weakness. But he didn't back down. Each word he spoke was a blade cutting through years of silence, shattering the safety of neutrality he had lived behind. The girl clung to his presence, her trembling easing slightly as she watched him stand when no one else ever had. For the first time, someone refused to let her fight alone. But the cost was clear. He could see board members slipping into the crowd, whispering into phones. He could almost hear the headlines forming. CEO loses control. CEO chooses child over empire. His career was unraveling in real time, every dollar of his fortune bleeding into the cracks of the pavement. And yet, for the first time, he didn't care. The confrontation reached its peak when one man, face twisted with hatred, shouted words, so vile they sliced through the plaza like a whip. The girl flinched as though struck, her body folding inward. That was the moment he snapped. He turned on the man, not with violence, but with truth so sharp it silenced even the loudest jeers. He demanded the crowd see her, not as a burden, not as a symbol, but as a child who deserved laughter, safety, and dignity, not humiliation. For a heartbeat, the world paused. The plaza fell quiet, cameras still rolling, eyes locked. on the man who had everything to lose and yet chose to risk it all for a little girl's dignity. The girl's small hand found the edge of his sleeve, clutching it tightly. In that grip was everything. Her fear, her gratitude, her hope. He realized then that he hadn't just defended her. He had given her proof that she wasn't invisible. That someone at last had seen her pain and refused to turn away. The silence broke with scattered applause, hesitant at first, then stronger. Not everyone clapped, not everyone understood, but the sound was enough to split the hostility, enough to show her that hate was not the only voice in the world, but for him, there was no going back. His empire would crumble, his reputation would burn, and the life he had built on comfort would be gone. Yet as he stood there with her hand in his, he knew this was the only fight that had ever truly mattered, and in that moment, stripped of everything, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. In the days that followed, the plaza confrontation became impossible to escape. Clips of it flooded the internet, headlines screamed his name, and the story spread far beyond the city. Some praised his courage, others mocked his downfall, but no one ignored it. For the first time in years, he was not in control of the narrative. The board moved quickly. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Investors withdrew, and allies vanished. His empire, once so stable, fractured overnight. Contracts dissolved, trust evaporated, and his name, once synonymous with power, became a cautionary tale whispered in the same breath as scandal. He watched it happen almost with detachment, as though his old life belonged to someone else. The wealth, the status, the accolades, none of it mattered anymore. What lingered with him wasn't the loss of power, but the image of the little girl standing in that plaza, her hand clutching his sleeve as the world raged around her. That image had burned itself into his soul, rewriting the man he thought he was. For her, the days after were quieter, though not easier. School was still a battlefield, the world still unkind, but something inside her had shifted. She had always believed she was invisible, that no one would ever speak for her. But she had seen a man risk everything, not for gain, not for recognition, but simply to tell the truth. And in that, she found a strength she had never known she carried. The plaza became a symbol. Strangers began to speak of it as a turning point, small though it was. Some who had stayed silent that day admitted their shame. Others who had clapped timidly in the crowd found themselves braver in their own lives. Change didn't sweep the world overnight, but a seed had been planted, watered by the courage of one choice. Years passed, and though his fortune never returned, something deeper took root. He devoted himself to causes he had once overlooked, using the remains of his influence to build spaces where children like her could find dignity, where silence was no longer survival, but choice. He became less of a CEO and more of a man, flawed, scarred, but finally free. And the girl? She grew into her voice. She carried the memory of that day as both wound and weapon, a reminder of how cruel the world could be, but also of how love could pierce through hate. She never forgot the way the world had tried to break her, and never forgot the man who stood so it could not. In the end, the story was not about a millionaire who lost his empire. It was about a child who gained her proof. Proof that even in the face of hate, courage could exist. Proof that one act of humanity could ripple outward, sparking change in hearts that had long stayed silent. And perhaps that is the lesson for all of us. Prejudice thrives when silence protects it, but it crumbles when even one voice dares to speak. So ask yourself, when the moment comes, when hate stands in front of you clothed in its ugliest form, will you turn away, or will you stand even if it costs you everything?